They stared at the plates in silence, certain this sweetness was their final taste before execution, but the Americans just smiled and offered seconds. December 18, 1944, Camp Ellis, Illinois. 52 German prisoners were American soldiers captured during the Battle of the Bulge sat at long wooden tables in a mess hall that still smelled of fresh paint. They'd arrived 3 days earlier, exhausted from the Atlantic crossing, disoriented by the vastness of America, and terrified about what awaited them. The propaganda had been clear. Captured soldiers faced starvation, forced labor unto death, or summary execution. Yet here they sat, in a warm building with electric lights, about to receive what guards had mysteriously called traditional American meal. The men ranged in age from 18 to 43. Some were career soldiers who'd fought since Poland in 1939. Others were recent conscripts, boys who'd been handed rifles and sent to the collapsing Western Front with minimal training. What united them was fear rooted in years of Nazi propaganda about Allied barbarism, reinforced by their own military's treatment of prisoners, which they assumed would be reciprocated.
During the journey from the battlefield to this Illinois camp, they'd witnessed things that contradicted their propaganda training. American medics had treated their wounds. Military police had processed them efficiently rather than brutally. The Atlantic transport, while uncomfortable, hadn't been deliberately cruel. Food had been minimal but present. No one had been beaten or executed. This confused them more than it reassured them. They kept waiting for the cruelty to begin. The mess hall doors opened and American kitchen staff entered carrying trays. The prisoners tensed, expecting the worst rations or something designed to humiliate them. What appeared instead was abundance: beef stew with vegetables, fresh bread with butter, milk, and coffee. Real coffee, not the acorn substitute they'd been drinking for years. The portions were substantial, the quality higher than what they'd received in their own military for months. But it was the dessert that stopped them completely. After the main course came plates bearing slices of apple pie, golden crust, cinnamon-spiced filling, steam still rising from the cuts. The aroma filled the room. Butter, sugar, baked apples, warmth. To men who'd been living on black bread and watery soup, who'd watched rations dwindle as Germany's supply lines collapsed, the sight was incomprehensible. Private Hans Müller, 19 years old from Bavaria, later described the moment. "I thought it was poison. I thought they were giving us this beautiful meal so we would die having tasted something wonderful, making our execution seem merciful. I looked around at my comrades, and I could see everyone thinking the same thing. This was too good to be real. It had to be our last meal." The Americans serving the food seemed genuinely confused by the prisoners' hesitation. One sergeant, speaking through a German-American interpreter, said simply, "It's apple pie. It's Thursday. We always serve pie on Thursdays. Eat up before it gets cold." The casualness of this statement was perhaps more shocking than the pie itself. This wasn't special treatment or psychological manipulation. This was routine. The Americans served pie every Thursday, to prisoners of war, the same pie they'd served to their own troops, as if feeding defeated enemies generous portions of dessert was the most normal thing in the world. Before we continue with this extraordinary story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Lost Portraits. We preserve the forgotten encounters of humanity found in war's darkest chapters. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your engagement helps us bring these stories to light. Now let's return to that December evening in 1944, where 52 German soldiers are confronting apple pie and everything it represents. This is a story about the dismantling of propaganda through abundance. It's about what happens when men condition to expect vengeance and counter hospitality instead. When prepared, hatred meets unexpected grace. In December 1944, as the Battle of the Bulge raged in Europe and Germany made its final desperate offensive, thousands of German soldiers became American prisoners. They arrived in America carrying Nazi propaganda's promises. That capture meant death. that Americans were racially inferior barbarians incapable of honor, that surrender was the ultimate shame. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required humane treatment of prisoners of war, but these German soldiers didn't believe Americans would honor such agreements. Why would they? Germany itself had violated Geneva Convention standards repeatedly, particularly on the Eastern Front. The prisoners assumed reciprocal cruelty. What their nation had inflicted on others would surely be inflicted on them. What they didn't understand was that American adherence to Geneva Convention standards wasn't conditional on enemy behavior. It was policy rooted in values about how civilized nations should conduct war, regardless of what their enemies did. This principled approach would prove more psychologically devastating to Nazi propaganda than any punishment could have been. The psychological preparation these soldiers carried was comprehensive. From the moment they'd entered military service, they'd been taught that Americans were mongrelized, weak, motivated by Jewish capitalism rather than honor. That American society, with its racial mixing and democratic chaos, produced inferior soldiers. That American wealth came from exploitation, and American power from numerical superiority rather than genuine strength. But the propaganda had also contained a darker message, that Americans, despite their supposed weakness, were vindictive and cruel to prisoners. This contradiction, weak yet vicious, inferior yet dangerous, created psychological confusion that made rational assessment impossible. The soldiers believed simultaneously that Americans couldn't fight effectively but would torture anyone they captured. Sitting in that mess hall, staring at apple pie, Private Miller and his comrades faced a reality that shattered all their conditioning. The Americans weren't starving them. They were overfeeding them by German military standards. They weren't executing them. They were serving dessert. They weren't demonstrating weakness or cruelty. They were showing a confidence so complete they could treat defeated enemies with casual hospitality. Captain James Reynolds, the officer overseeing Camp Ellis's prisoner operations, had his own philosophy about the apple pie tradition. "These men have been lied to," he'd told his staff. "They've been told we're monsters. Every day we treat them decently, we prove their leaders lied. Every meal we serve, every Geneva Convention standard we honor, we demonstrate that their propaganda was false. That's more powerful than any interrogation technique. Let them taste American abundance, American values, American confidence. Let them realize they've been fighting for a system that lied to them while we, their supposed barbaric enemies, treat them better than their own government did." The apple pie sat cooling on plates in front of 52 German prisoners who couldn't decide if this was mercy or the prelude to execution. What happened next would challenge everything they believed about their enemies, their nation, and themselves. To understand why apple pie could shake these men so profoundly, we need to step back 2 years, to when most had been conscripted into Hitler's increasingly desperate military. By 1942, Germany's early war victories had stalled. The Eastern Front had become a meat grinder consuming entire divisions. American entry into the war meant facing industrial might that dwarfed German production capacity. The Wehrmacht needed constant reinforcement, drafting younger and older men, lowering standards, rushing training. Private Hans Miller had been drafted in early 1943, 3 months after turning 18. He'd been working on his family's farm in Bavaria when conscription papers arrived. His training lasted 12 weeks, basic marksmanship, military discipline, and intensive ideological indoctrination. The political education was comprehensive. Lectures about German racial superiority, films depicting Allied atrocities, constant reinforcement that they were fighting for civilization's survival against subhuman enemies. They showed us propaganda films about American prisoner camps, Hans recalled in a 1987 interview. Starving German soldiers, beatings, deliberate cruelty. They told us Americans hated Germans because we were superior, that they'd torture us for information then execute us. The message was clear: fight to the death, because surrender means suffering worse than any battlefield death. This programming wasn't just military training. It was psychological conditioning, designed to make surrender literally unthinkable. The Nazi military code explicitly stated that German soldiers should die rather than be captured. Surrender was portrayed not just as tactical failure but as moral collapse, racial betrayal, ultimate shame. The indoctrination was reinforced by Germany's treatment of its own prisoners. German soldiers knew, even if they didn't discuss it openly, that their military treated Soviet prisoners abominably. Starvation, exposure, execution were routine. They assumed this was normal wartime behavior, that all nations treated captured enemies similarly. The propaganda exploited this. Since Germany treated Soviet prisoners harshly, though this was understated, obviously the Soviets and their allies would treat German prisoners worse. What the propaganda never mentioned was the distinction between Eastern and Western Front prisoner treatment, or that Geneva Convention standards existed and many nations honored them. The soldiers were kept ignorant of alternatives, trapped in a worldview where only cruelty was possible. Hans was sent to the Western Front in June 1944, shortly after D-Day. His unit spent months in defensive positions, retreating gradually as Allied forces advanced. He witnessed Germany's military collapse in real time, supply shortages, communication breakdowns, leadership chaos. Officers who'd promised ultimate victory months earlier now spoke only of holding positions temporarily. By December 1944, when Germany launched the Ardennes Offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, Hans's unit was composed largely of replacements, poorly equipped and inadequately supplied. They attacked American positions with initial success, but within days the offensive stalled. Hans found himself trapped in a pocket with dwindling ammunition, no food, and temperatures below freezing. "We were starving," he remembered. "We'd been promised supply drops that never came. Some men ate tree bark, others were collapsing from exposure. When American forces overran our position, I was too weak to run. I waited for them to shoot me. Instead, they gave me a blanket and a tin of rations." That initial moment of capture contained the first crack in his propaganda conditioning. The Americans who captured him were efficient rather than cruel. They secured prisoners, treated wounded, provided basic necessities. Hans kept waiting for the brutality to start, but it didn't. Not during initial capture, not during transport to holding areas, not during the weeks-long journey to America. The Atlantic crossing in late December was uncomfortable. The ship was crowded, conditions were basic, many prisoners were seasick, but it wasn't deliberately torturous. The Americans maintained order, provided food, kept the prisoners separate from their own troops. Hans expected at any moment to be taken on deck and thrown overboard, but such fears were never realized. Arriving in America itself was psychologically overwhelming. The ship docked at New York Harbor, and the prisoners saw the Manhattan skyline, massive, intact, brilliantly lit despite wartime. This was supposed to be an enemy nation under attack, yet it looked untouched, prosperous, impossibly powerful. The contrast with bombed German cities couldn't have been starker. "That's when I first understood we'd lost," Hans said. "Not just the battle, but the war. Germany was being destroyed while America built skyscrapers. We'd been told we were the superior race, the mighty power, yet here was a nation that made us look primitive. The propaganda had lied about American weakness. They weren't weak at all." The train journey to Illinois took them through American heartland. Farms with abundant livestock, towns with well-fed civilians, infrastructure functioning normally. For prisoners who'd left Germany as food rations collapsed and cities burned, the abundance was shocking. Some began questioning whether the propaganda had lied about other things, too. By the time Hans and his comrades arrived at Camp Ellis in mid-December, they'd experienced 3 weeks of American captivity without the cruelty they'd been promised. But they hadn't stopped believing it would come. They'd rationalized the decent treatment as temporary. Perhaps Americans needed them for interrogation or labor. Perhaps the real punishment awaited at permanent camps. Camp Ellis itself was well organized. Neat barracks, electric lights, heating, bathroom facilities with running water. The prisoners were issued clean uniforms, blankets, basic hygiene supplies. Medical staff examined them, treating malnutrition, frostbite, and various ailments. The efficiency was impressive, but it remained confusing. During their first days, the prisoners were processed, photographed, documented, assigned to barracks, given orientation through interpreters about camp rules. They learned they'd be required to work. Geneva Convention allowed prisoner labor for non-military purposes. They'd be paid minimal wages, they could send limited correspondence home, they'd receive regular meals. The work assignments were to be in camp maintenance and nearby farms, labor that was tedious but not brutal. The conditions were basic but adequate. By Geneva Convention standards, everything was proper. But the German prisoners didn't understand Geneva Convention standards because their propaganda training had never mentioned them. "We kept waiting to be put in death camps," Hans explained. "We knew Germany had labor camps where prisoners died from work and starvation. We assumed Americans had similar facilities. The fact that Camp Ellis looked almost comfortable made us suspicious. We thought it was a show for Red Cross inspectors, that the real camps were elsewhere." This suspicion persisted until Thursday, December 18th, 3 days after their arrival, when they were assembled for their first regular meal in the camp mess hall. They filed in nervously, sat at long tables, and waited for whatever would happen next. They expected minimal rations. They received beef stew. They expected water. They received milk and coffee. They expected to be watched with hostility. They encountered staff who seemed almost bored by routine. And then came the apple pie, golden, steaming, impossibly abundant. And with it, the collapse of everything they'd been taught to believe about their enemies. For nearly a full minute, no one moved. 52 German prisoners sat frozen, staring at slices of apple pie, while American kitchen staff waited patiently for them to eat. Private Hans Miller later described his racing thoughts. "I was certain it was poisoned. That was the only explanation that made sense. They'd fattened us up with the stew so the poison would work faster. Or maybe it wasn't poison. Maybe it was a test to see who would accept charity from the enemy, and those who ate would be marked as weak and executed." Every scenario my propaganda-trained mind could generate was sinister. Corporal Friedrich Weber, sitting across from Hans, was thinking differently. "I thought perhaps this was how Americans mocked us. Give us delicious food we hadn't tasted in years, let us enjoy it, then tell us it was our last meal before execution. Make our deaths cruel by showing us what we'd lost, what we'd never have again." Neither man could conceive that the apple pie was simply what the sergeant had said. Thursday dessert, routine camp food, nothing more sinister than American military catering. The American staff, increasingly puzzled by the prisoners' paralysis, began eating their own portions. Kitchen workers took bites of pie from the same trays, guards poured themselves coffee from the same pots, the sergeant cut himself an extra-large slice and ate it with obvious enjoyment. The message was clear. The food is safe. This isn't a trick. Just eat. Finally, an older prisoner, Sergeant Otto Braun, 43, a veteran who'd fought since the war's beginning, picked up his fork. He was the highest-ranking man present, and his actions carried weight. He cut a small piece of pie, lifted it to his mouth, and tasted it. The flavor hit him like a physical shock. Real sugar, not saccharin. Real butter in the crust, not margarine substitute. Apples cooked with cinnamon, a spice that had become impossibly rare in Germany. The texture was tender, the filling sweet and tart simultaneously, the crust flaky and rich. It tasted like peacetime, like childhood, like a world before war. Otto took another bite, then another. He was crying, though he tried to hide it. Around him, other men watched this display with complex emotions. If Sergeant Braun, tough veteran Otto Braun, was eating and weeping, what did that mean? One by one, the others began eating. Some remained cautious, taking tiny bites and waiting for effects. Others, once they'd overcome initial fear, ate with desperate intensity born of years of deprivation. Within minutes, the mess hall filled with the sounds of men eating and the occasional quiet sob from those overwhelmed by the collision of expectation and reality. Hans Miller ate his slice slowly, savoring each bite while his mind struggled to process the implications. "The pie was better than anything I'd eaten in 2 years," he recalled. "Better than my last Christmas at home, better than any field ration, better than the victory meals our officers had promised were coming, and the Americans were serving it to us, their prisoners, their defeated enemies, as if it was nothing special." As routine Thursday dessert. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. These were supposed to be barbaric enemies, yet they were serving dessert that demonstrated abundance, skill, and a casual generosity that spoke to confidence and values the propaganda had never acknowledged. If Americans were inferior, why was their food superior? If they were cruel, why serve pie? If Germany was winning, why were prisoners eating better in American captivity than German soldiers had eaten at the front? After the meal, as the prisoners filed out of the mess hall, several were openly weeping. Others walked in stunned silence. A few talked excitedly in whispers, comparing the experience to their memories of pre-war meals. The American guards watched this reaction with a mixture of satisfaction and bemusement. They'd expected gratitude, perhaps, but not this profound emotional breakdown over dessert. Captain Reynolds, observing from the mess hall entrance, later wrote in his report, "The prisoners' reaction to standard Thursday meal suggests severe deprivation in German military supply chain. Several men appeared to be experiencing genuine emotional crisis triggered by pie. Recommend continued standard feeding schedule as a psychological warfare tool more effective than any interrogation technique." That night in the barracks, the German prisoners couldn't sleep. They lay in bunks with actual mattresses under warm blankets, with full stomachs for the first time in months, and processed what had happened. Some remained suspicious. "It's temporary," insisted one young private. "They're fattening us up for labor. Once we're stronger, the real work begins and the food will disappear. You'll see." But even he sounded uncertain, as if trying to convince himself more than others. Others had begun questioning everything. If they lied about American treatment of prisoners, Friedrich Weber said quietly, what else did they lie about? Were the British really as bad as we were told? Were the Russians? Were we actually fighting for civilization? Or were we the ones destroying it? This questioning represented dangerous territory for men raised in totalitarian systems. To doubt one piece of propaganda meant potentially doubting all of it. To acknowledge their leaders had lied about enemy cruelty meant confronting the possibility that everything, the racial superiority, the justifications for war, the promises of victory, had been lies. Hans Miller lay awake, replaying the taste of apple pie, thinking about the sergeant who'd eaten from the same tray, the kitchen staff who'd served with casual professionalism rather than hatred, the guards who'd watched their emotional reactions with what looked like pity rather than contempt. "I started crying again," he remembered. Not from happiness, but from grief. Grief for all the suffering that had been unnecessary, for all the soldiers who died rather than surrender because they believed the propaganda about prisoner treatment. I thought about my friend Klaus, who'd shot himself rather than be captured by Americans 2 weeks earlier. He'd died believing he was avoiding torture, but he was actually avoiding apple pie and clean sheets. The waste of it, the stupid, tragic waste, overwhelmed me. The next morning, when the prisoners assembled for breakfast and were served eggs, bacon, toast, and coffee, another abundant meal, the psychological transformation continued. This wasn't a one-time show for inspectors. This was daily routine. The Americans were going to keep feeding them well, keep treating them decently, keep demonstrating through actions that everything the Nazi propaganda had promised about Allied cruelty was false. Some men adapted quickly, accepting this new reality with relief. Others struggled, clinging to propaganda as the last familiar thing in a world that had become incomprehensible. But all of them, whether they acknowledged it or not, had felt the foundation of their beliefs crack when they tasted that apple pie. By the end of that first week, when Thursday came around again and pie was served once more, the prisoners ate without hesitation. They'd learned the pattern. Thursday meant pie. That was just what happened here. The Americans kept their promises, followed their routines, maintained standards. And slowly, bite by bite, week by week, the propaganda crumbled. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Propaganda, absorbed over years and reinforced by fear, dissolves slowly through accumulated evidence that contradicts it. During their first month at Camp Ellis, the 52 German prisoners settled into routines that bore no resemblance to what they'd been taught to expect. They woke to morning roll call, ate breakfast in the mess hall, worked assigned jobs around the camp or on nearby farms, ate lunch and dinner, had evening free time, then returned to barracks for lights out. The routine was predictable, the treatment consistent, the food abundant. Every Thursday brought pie. Sometimes apple, sometimes cherry, occasionally peach when supplies allowed. The dessert became a marker of normalcy, proof that the decent treatment wasn't temporary theater but actual American policy toward prisoners. Hans Müller was assigned to work detail at a nearby farm, helping with winter maintenance and equipment repair. The farmer, Mr. Johnson, was an elderly man whose son was fighting in Europe. Hans expected hostility. This man's son was risking death fighting Germans. Surely he'd hate German prisoners. Instead, Mr. Johnson treated Hans with gruff but fair professionalism, showing him tasks, correcting mistakes without cruelty, sharing coffee during breaks. One cold January morning, Mr. Johnson brought thermoses of hot soup to the work detail. As he handed Hans a cup, he said through the interpreter, "My boy's over there somewhere, probably cold and hungry. I figured treating you decent is like putting good karma out there, you know. Maybe some German farmer is giving my son soup right now." The interpreter hesitated before translating, uncertain how Hans would receive this. Hans listened, then responded, "I hope someone is. Your son doesn't deserve to suffer just because our leaders started this war." Mr. Johnson nodded. They drank soup in silence. Enemy and enemy's father, briefly just two men trying to stay warm. Back at camp, other small moments accumulated. Corporal Friedrich Weber worked in the camp library, cataloging books and managing lending to prisoners. The American librarian, a corporal from New York, shared his love of German literature, speaking enthusiastically about Goethe and Schiller in broken German. They spent hours discussing books, transcending enmity through shared appreciation of culture. He treated German literature with more respect than our own government had. Friedrich later recalled, "The Nazis had banned or burned books they considered degenerate. Here was an American who'd read more German philosophy than I had, who valued it, who wanted to discuss it. It shattered the propaganda about Americans being culturally inferior." The prisoners also encountered unexpected diversity. Camp Ellis staff included black soldiers, Jewish American soldiers, Japanese Americans from the 422nd serving as interpreters, immigrants from dozens of countries. The propaganda had taught that American diversity was weakness, that racial mixing produced inferior society. Instead, the prisoners observed functional cooperation, professional competence, shared purpose that transcended differences. One evening, a black sergeant, Staff Sergeant James Williams, taught some German prisoners how to play baseball during rec time. He explained rules patiently, demonstrated technique, laughed when they made mistakes but kept encouraging them. For men raised under Nazi racial ideology that classified non-white people as subhuman, being taught by a black soldier who was competent, patient, and treated them with dignity created profound cognitive dissonance. Hans struggled with this. "I'd been taught my entire life that I was racially superior," he admitted in later interviews. "Then I watched this black American soldier demonstrate skills I don't have, teach with patience I wouldn't have shown, and treat us with dignity despite knowing what Germany's racial policies were. It forced me to confront that everything I'd been taught about race was lies designed to make us feel superior when we weren't." Music became another bridge. Some prisoners were musicians who'd played in military bands. The camp commandant allowed them to form a small ensemble: accordion, harmonica, a borrowed guitar, and perform occasional concerts. American soldiers attended, applauding German folk songs and classical pieces. In return, American musicians taught the Germans some American tunes. One remarkable evening in February, a combined German-American impromptu jam session happened in the rec hall. German accordion played alongside American guitar, folk melodies blended, language barriers dissolved in rhythm. Sergeant Braun, the veteran who'd been first to eat the apple pie, played harmonica while an American corporal sang. For perhaps an hour, former enemies made music together. The guards at Camp Ellis maintained professional distance but weren't cruel. One guard, Private Miller from Wisconsin, learned basic German phrases and used them during rounds. "Guten Morgen," "Wie geht's?" Simple courtesy that acknowledged the prisoner's humanity. Another guard, whose grandmother had been German immigrants, sometimes shared stories about German-American heritage, helping prisoners understand that German culture existed in America and was valued, separate from Nazi ideology. The mail system provided another transformative element. Prisoners were allowed to send limited correspondence home and receive letters from family. Hans received his first letter from home in late January. His mother writing that they'd survived Allied bombing. His father had been wounded on the Eastern Front but would recover. His sister was safe. The letter was censored but intact, proof that Americans allowed communication. More significantly, his mother's letter included a plea: "Stay safe where you are. We hear prisoners in America are treated well. Don't try to escape or cause trouble. Just survive until this war ends and you can come home." Even German civilians were learning that American captivity was preferable to continued fighting. By March 1945, as news of Germany's collapsing front lines reached the camp through official announcements, the prisoners' attitudes had transformed dramatically. Most had stopped thinking of themselves as temporarily detained soldiers who'd returned to fighting. They'd become men waiting for a war to end, grateful to be waiting in safety and comfort rather than dying in collapsing Germany. When Thursday pie came around, they ate it without the emotional devastation of that first serving. It had become expected, even anticipated. But several prisoners, including Hans, made a point of thanking the kitchen staff each week. Through interpreters, they expressed gratitude not just for the pie but for what it represented. Evidence that they'd been lied to, proof that humanity could transcend enmity, demonstration that values mattered even in war. "That pie saved my life," Hans later reflected. "Not physically, the Americans weren't going to execute us regardless, but psychologically it saved me. It forced me to confront that I'd been fighting for a lie, that the enemy I'd feared was actually more honorable than the leaders I'd trusted. It gave me permission to stop believing the propaganda and start thinking for myself. That's a kind of salvation that matters more than physical survival." When word reached Camp Ellis in early May that Germany had surrendered, the reaction among prisoners was complex. Relief that the war had ended mixed with grief for their destroyed homeland, uncertainty about the future, and, for many, gratitude that they'd spent the war's final months in America rather than witnessing Germany's apocalyptic collapse. That Thursday, the kitchen served pie as usual. The prisoners ate it quietly, processing the end of the Third Reich over apple filling and flaky crust. It was, several later remarked, the most appropriate possible way to mark the end of Nazi Germany, with American abundance and American values, the things that had defeated them more thoroughly than bombs ever could. Repatriation began in late 1945 and continued through 1946. The German prisoners at Camp Ellis would return to a homeland that no longer existed as they'd known it, occupied, divided, physically and psychologically devastated by total defeat. Hans Müller returned to Bavaria in August 1946. The train journey from the port through Germany was horrifying. City after city in ruins, infrastructure destroyed, millions displaced. When he finally reached his village, he found his family alive, but his home damaged by bombing. His father, wounded on the Eastern Front, was recovering slowly. His younger brother had died in Berlin during the final battle. The Germany he'd left in 1943 was gone forever. But Hans carried something home that most returning soldiers didn't: a fundamentally altered worldview. "I came back knowing our propaganda had been lies," he later explained. "I'd spent 18 months in American captivity being treated better than our own military had treated us. I'd eaten pie every Thursday while my family starved. That knowledge made reintegration very difficult." Post-war Germany was consumed with survival, finding food, rebuilding shelter, navigating occupation, processing collective trauma. Most Germans clung to narratives that minimized their complicity or emphasized their own suffering. Acknowledging that the enemy had been decent, that American prisoners had been well fed while German civilians starved, felt like betrayal of shared suffering. Hans learned to be careful about sharing his American experiences. When he mentioned how well he'd been treated, some Germans accused him of being weak or Americanized. Others refused to believe him, insisting he was exaggerating or misremembering. The cognitive dissonance worked both ways. If Germans accepted that Americans had treated prisoners humanely, they had to confront that Germany's treatment of prisoners had been inhumane, which meant acknowledging broader German guilt. "I stopped talking about the apple pie," Hans said. "People didn't want to hear it. They needed to believe we'd all suffered equally, that the Allies were as bad as we'd been told. Admitting I'd been comfortable while they starved felt like rubbing salt in wounds, so I stayed quiet and tried to rebuild." But the memory didn't fade. Hans became a carpenter, married, raised children in rebuilt Bavaria. He didn't speak much about the war, but he raised his children with insistent emphasis on questioning authority, on seeking multiple perspectives, on recognizing propaganda. "I told them, if your government says someone is subhuman, that's when you need to question most carefully. Because I was taught Americans were barbarians, and they gave me pie." Other Camp Ellis prisoners had similar experiences. Friedrich Weber returned to find his entire family had died, his wife in Dresden's bombing, his parents in the war's chaos. He rebuilt his life in Hamburg, becoming a translator. His war experience had taught him that language-built bridges propaganda tried to burn, so he devoted himself to facilitating communication. "I spent the war learning that the enemy spoke different languages but shared humanity," he said in a 1970s interview. "So I made my career about helping people understand each other across language barriers. Every translation I did was an act of defiance against the propaganda that tried to make us see each other as monsters." Sergeant Otto Braun, the veteran who'd first eaten the pie and wept, never fully recovered psychologically. He'd spent years believing in and fighting for Nazi Germany, had witnessed and participated in horrors on the Eastern Front, then experienced American decency that proved his entire worldview had been constructed on lies. The contradiction broke something in him. He returned to Germany in late 1946, worked sporadically, drank heavily, and died in 1952 at age 51. At his funeral, his daughter found a journal he'd kept. One entry, dated December 18, 1944, read simply, "They gave us pie. I don't understand. How could we have been so wrong about everything?" In the 1970s, as Germany's post-war generation began seriously examining Nazi-era crimes and experiences, some former Camp Ellis prisoners participated in oral history projects. Hans Müller was interviewed by a university researcher studying POW experiences. During the interview, he broke down describing that first Thursday pie. "I've thought about it for 30 years, he said. That pie represented everything we'd been denied, not just sugar and butter, but truth. The Americans didn't have to treat us well. We'd been their enemies, soldiers of a regime that committed atrocities. They could have given us minimal rations and satisfied Geneva Convention requirements. Instead, they served us pie. And in doing so, they forced us to confront that our entire belief system was lies." The researcher asked what he thought the apple pie meant in the broader sense. Hans considered carefully before answering. "It meant that values matter, that how you treat your enemies defines who you are more than how you treat friends. The Americans could have become monsters to fight monsters, could have brutalized us the way we'd brutalized others. Instead, they maintained their values even when facing people who hadn't maintained ours. That's strength. That's civilization. Everything we'd been taught about strength being domination and cruelty, that pie proved it was propaganda. Real strength is maintaining humanity even toward enemies." In 1985, a group of former Camp Ellis prisoners organized a reunion in Bavaria. About 20 attended, men now in their 60s and 70s, with families and careers, carrying decades of post-war life. They spent the weekend sharing memories, processing experiences, and attempting to make sense of what that time had meant. On the final evening, Hans Müller surprised everyone by bringing apple pie he'd baked following an American recipe he'd obtained through correspondence. The men ate it in silence, old soldiers remembering when they were young and terrified and certain that sweetness meant death, only to discover it meant hope. "We were lucky," one attendee remarked, "lucky to have been captured by Americans rather than dying in Germany's collapse. Lucky to have learned the truth about propaganda through pie rather than never learning it at all. Lucky to have been treated with dignity we didn't deserve and didn't expect." When Hans Müller died in 1994, his family found among his possessions a yellowed piece of paper with a recipe for apple pie written in English, carefully translated into German. Attached was a note in his handwriting. "This is what truth tastes like. Never forget that propaganda makes you afraid to taste it." The story of those 52 German prisoners who mistook dessert for execution illustrates a profound paradox. Kindness can be more devastating to evil than cruelty. The Americans who served apple pie to enemy prisoners weren't being soft or weak. They were demonstrating that their values were stronger than the circumstances that tested them. Nazi propaganda had taught those soldiers that Americans were inferior, that might makes right, that the weak deserve contempt. Every Thursday, a slice of pie proved those teachings false. Every Thursday, abundance and hospitality demonstrated that civilization isn't about domination, but about maintaining humanity even toward those who've lost theirs. The war ended for Germany on May 8, 1945. But it ended for those 52 prisoners much earlier, on December 18, 1944, when they bit into apple pie and tasted the truth their propaganda had spent years hiding. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is feeding your enemies, because in doing so, you prove that the values you fight for aren't negotiable based on whom you're facing. They thought it was their last meal. Instead, it was their first taste of freedom from lies, and that made all the difference.